Welcome to Prescription for Justice. My name is Martin Donahue, and I'm your host. This is episode number 22 today, and all the other episodes can be viewed on YouTube under Prescription for Justice or in podcast form on KBOO Radio. You can also visit the Public Health and Social Justice website, where you'll find numerous open access PowerPoint slideshows, articles, syllabi for course teaching, and over 1,000 links to organizations involved in a number of issues. Today's episode is entitled Donald Trump is Mentally Unfit to be President. In today's program, we are joined by an internationally renowned psychiatrist and author to discuss Donald Trump's mental fitness to be president. We have discussed Trump's background, ecocidal policies, racism, warmongering, contempt for norms of Western democracy and international law, narcissism, and sociopathic traits on prior episodes of this program, notably Episode 8 entitled Complicit. Today, we are fortunate to have as a guest Dr. Bandy Lee, editor of the book The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. Dr. Lee is a forensic psychiatrist and an internationally recognized expert on violence and a member of the faculty of Yale School of Medicine's Law and Psychiatry Division. She served as director of research for the Center for the Study of Violence and co-founded Yale's Violence and Health Study Group, and leads a project group for the World Health Organization's Violence Prevention Alliance. She has consulted with the governments of Ireland and France, as well as 4 U.S. states on violence prevention programming in prisons and in the community. She played a key role in initiating reforms at Rikers Island, New York City's correctional facility known for extreme levels of violence. She has served as consultant to the World Health Organization Violence and Injury Prevention Department, UNESCO, and other United Nations bodies, and as a speaker to the World Economic Forum. She co-founded and directs the World Mental Health Coalition, which assembles mental health experts to exchange with other disciplines on how they can collaboratively protect societal mental health. Dr. Lee, thank you for joining us. And I must say,
very much for having me.
To our viewers, that is the trimmed down bio. Dr. Lee and I were just commenting on how I can't imagine how she ever sleeps with all that she does, and she's very passionate and, as I said, well known for her work. So we'll delve right into things. Bandy, tell us about the origins of the book that you edited, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump.
It's first of all, let me say my views are my own, although I do represent the World Mental Health Coalition as its president. Well, the book came about because we were discussing among ourselves, us mental health professionals, and discovered very quickly we had a consensus, a medical consensus, that the president, Donald Trump, in the office of the presidency, posed a danger to the nation and the international community because of the powers of his office. And we were trying to figure out what to do. It turned out that many of us were afraid to speak up, not so much for reasons of ethics, although we were concerned about that also, but rather because we thought that our licenses would be in danger because of a litigious president who would come after those who would speak up against him, or our physical safety because of the violence proneness of his supporters. And so I decided to try to break the ice through a conference, and we called it, Does Professional Responsibility Include a Duty to Warn? So a duty to warn when a public figure poses a threat to society. And unfortunately, it had very sparse attendance, despite having prime auditorium space at Yale School of Medicine with some of the most renowned speakers in psychiatry. And so at first I thought it was a total flop, and then hundreds and hundreds of mental health professionals later got in touch with me once they heard about the conference, and not only within this country but from around the world. And that's how the World Mental Health Coalition came to be formed, and the proceedings of the conference formed the book, which includes just 27 mental health experts because of the limitations of the book size. And later on, it was expanded to 37, but now there are thousands of mental health professionals who have joined us, and it's really an unprecedented event that so many psychiatrists, psychologists, and other mental health professionals would come forth like this.
And I want to come back in a little bit to the ethical issues involved here in speaking out and what various professional organizations' policies have been. But first, can you lay out for our viewers the specific reasons, character traits, et cetera, why you and your colleagues believe that Trump is unfit to be president?
Initially, we wanted to move the discussion away from mental illness because mental illness in itself does not make an individual dangerous. In fact, those suffering from mental illness are often less violent as a whole than the general population.
And often quite accomplished poets, artists, etc.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. And it doesn't make one unfit to perform one's duties. There are many individuals with severe mental illnesses who still, seek the help they need and still are able to perform perfectly at work. So that alone, and including presidents, there was a Duke University study that showed that almost half of U.S. presidents have suffered from some kind of mental illness, and yet they have been some of the best leaders.
Right. Lincoln with depression, for instance.
Yes. Abraham Lincoln, for example, has been said to have had more compassion for people because of the depression he suffered. And in that manner, many individuals overcome the hardships of mental illness and make it a strength even than a cause for concern. But here we were concerned about the president's dangerousness as well as potential unfitness. And as a violence expert, I could speak about the dangerousness, his verbal aggression, his history of sexual assaults, and boasting about them, his incitement to violence at his rallies, his endorsement of violence in key speeches, his taunting of hostile nations and nuclear powers, and all of these were signs of danger that I was very concerned about. He also showed signs and symptoms that are associated with dangerousness, including impulsivity, recklessness, proneness to paranoid ideations, a lack of empathy, and a constant need to buttress one's sense of self in a way that seemed to direct placing one's own emotional needs above the needs of the nation that could predispose one to violence.
And also some problems with basic information processing and ability to comprehend the truth and to transmit the truth. Certainly his presidency has been very chaotic, and we're filming this on the day following 2 more mass shootings in this country. And his response has been typical of previous responses, and I think we'll see that played out over the following days of attacking anyone who throws the remotest criticism that perhaps his words about undocumented immigrants, about the marchers in Charlottesville with good people on both sides, taunting crowds to assault people, send her back, all of those comments that he's made, he'll double down on those, I'm afraid.
The severe emotional needs that prevent him from accepting reality as it is, or to take in basic information and facts, and to accept reality as, all of us learn to do in our own maturation stages. He has never been able to do that, or has shown signs of being able to do that. And so he would attack those who would challenge his sense of reality.
And we've seen this play out before in history, this sort of demagoguery and totalitarianism, and it doesn't end well. Do you want to make some historical comparisons?
Well, there is an author in our book, in the second edition, who speaks specifically to this issue, and he cites Stalin, Hitler, Mao, and multiple historical examples, and it's understandable from the standpoint where there's 1% of the population that carries dangerous personality traits, and then they disproportionately seek power to fulfill their own pathological needs. Not that they wish to lead or contribute in any way that most leaders would do, but they end up attaining power because of their intense drive. And so this 1% in the population ends up occupying 10% of leadership positions. And as you have stated, it never ends well. They tend to, they're responsible for the vast majority of atrocities in world history, and they end up pretty much grinding their countries down to the ground and destroying what civilizations that they have had.
Right, and I am afraid that his presidency will take us decades to recover from. Hopefully, whoever is elected next, and hopefully that will be in 2020, will at least begin to get us back on some sort of international footing vis-a-vis the respect that we hold, at least for our democratic ideals. Granted, we don't always carry them out, but at least reform some of our alliances and be taken seriously. Because I think it's at the point where, for many of our allies in the rest of the world, they're incredibly nervous. Alliances are faltering. This is a time of great danger, with many countries possessing nuclear weapons, with some countries like us and Russia and China and elsewhere having those on hair trigger alert, where they can literally be launched and reach their targets within 30 to 45 minutes. And to have someone as petulant in charge of the country and in charge of pushing those buttons is very dangerous. In fact, there is a bill before Congress right now, House 669, sponsored by Representative Ted Lieu of California, and that would prohibit the president from using the armed forces to conduct a first-use nuclear strike unless that was conducted pursuant to a congressional declaration of war expressly authorizing such a strike. And that is obviously going to be held up when it reaches the Senate, because unfortunately many in the Senate are complicit and for whatever reason are supporting Trump and kind of all into the bitter end. Now, I want to make a distinction here. I think you're saying specifically that you're not making a specific psychiatric diagnosis, correct?
That's
correct.
What you
are doing is you are recognizing, given your expertise, a series of traits that, given the responsibilities of the office, make Trump unfit to hold that office, correct?
Yes, and we're actually alerting about the signs of concern so that a formal evaluation could be conducted. A full diagnostic neuropsychiatric evaluation would be ideal, but since we haven't been able to do that, what we have done is actually, when the Mueller report came out, it gave us exactly the kinds of information in high quality and in abundance, what we would seek to do a functional exam. In other words, does the president have the mental capacity to carry out the duties of his office? And will he not pose a danger to himself or others in the process of carrying out his duties? And so we actually had enough information to make that assessment.
And certainly Bob Woodward's book, I'm sure, added fuel to the fire. His book, Fear. He's a respected journalist who interviewed many people who are in the Trump's inner circle. I'll mention there is another House bill that would actually establish an oversight commission on the president's capacity, consisting of leaders of the House and Senate and various cabinet positions, as well as some appointed officials, including a medical professional. Again, that's not gone anywhere, but that's something to think about. Now, there is some precedent for psychiatrists' duty to warn. That would be the Tarasoff rule, the Goldwater rule. Maybe you could just briefly tell us what each of those are, since our viewers might not be familiar with those, and how what you have done has created a little bit of controversy vis-a-vis some misunderstandings of what the Goldwater rule really means. So if you could start with Tarasoff, Goldwater, and then proceeding
Yes.
that would be great.
A little controversy would be an understatement. It really has become a feud within the psychiatric field. Um, but it started because my whole engagement in this affair has started with ethical deliberations. Because when the morning after Donald Trump's election, I was bombarded with phone calls and emails and messages from members of the public because I was a violence expert, and whether or not to speak up in this way when I have no experience of doing so and no recent memory of psychiatrists being involved in this way, I had to think anew whether or not it would be ethical. And my conclusion was that the entire field of professional ethics pointed toward speaking up. Because when there's a patient, for example, we have confidentiality rules, and those are considered to be sacrosanct. But in the event of danger to others or the public, we have a duty to warn. We're mandated reporters, as well as have a duty to warn and a duty to protect in cases of danger when we have information about danger, however the information is obtained. So when the American Psychiatric Association...
Well, hold just a second. That came up in the Tarasoff ruling then. So the Tarasoff ruling was that a psychiatrist had information, and correct me if I'm wrong here, about someone who had threatened the life of a specific person.
Well, actually, I'm speaking more generally.
Okay.
The Tarasoff might fall under the more general guidelines to warn, to even breach the sacred rules of confidentiality within medicine, within psychiatry, when there is danger.
A specific threat, correct.
Yes.
And we do that in internal medicine, for instance, with mandated
yes.
reportable diseases and contact tracing for things like
Exactly.
measles and even HIV in some cases, and certainly anthrax and brucellosis and other infectious diseases that could be used in biowarfare. So,
yes, it's very much the same principle. So I have been a staunch supporter of the Goldwater rule for 20 years. Even though I'm a forensic psychiatrist, and in forensic cases we are exempt because we often testify about public figures and minor public figures. But I believed in the Goldwater rule because that is a standard I wish to bring to public figures. But what alarmed me was when the American Psychiatric Association, 2 months into this presidency, 2 months after Donald Trump's inauguration, changed the Goldwater rule to mean not just preventing diagnosis. So the original Goldwater rule says this: psychiatrists have a responsibility to patients as well as to society, and we should participate in activities that contribute, that improve the community and better public health. And when we're asked about a public figure, we should educate the public in general terms, but just don't diagnose. That is what the Goldwater rule says. But the American Psychiatric Association came out and reinterpreted the Goldwater rule to mean not just diagnosis, but anything you can say about any objective aspect, any observable aspect of a public figure, you could not utter unless you had performed a personal examination and gotten consent to state it. And so basically we were gagged. And it specified that we were not to speak even in the event of a national emergency. And that is what really alerted me to the problems of this situation, because that not only goes against our First Amendment rights, it goes against the very reason for which the First Amendment exists. That if we were to see problems of leadership, and in my mind, a dangerous regime, a potential tyrannical regime, would first wish to silence the experts and intellectuals, as well as the press. because these are the checks against abuses of power and potential dangerous consequences. And when we have the training of psychology and psychiatry, which would indicate to us dangerous personalities that would not only mislead the public down a dangerous path, but also be able to manipulate the public into endorsing them into believing what they were not. In other words, manipulate, deceive, and
create an artificial truth, which is much more easy today in the era of deep fakes and artificially created videos and so on, that we really need to watch out for. So the Goldwater rule was changed. You made your comments. I know you've had some problems with the American Psychiatric Association's policies in the past, specifically with pharmaceutical industry influence.
Psychiatric Association, yes. I was a member, I was a fellow in the past, but I resigned approximately a dozen years ago because their pharmaceutical industry ties became too heavy. And in fact, they were accepting 30% of their funding from pharmaceutical companies. And their policies reflected this. In the beginning stages, when I first joined, they were great advocates of patients and patient rights. Now they were advocating for pharmacotherapy and chemical therapy above patient interest. And now with the Goldwater rule, the way that they have changed it in this era, we were told that actually one of the leaders of the American Psychiatric Association confessed that they did so. They made the changes, created a gag rule to protect their federal funding. And so
that is very frightening on many levels. And I think we see that playing out in a number of our government agencies, the EPA, the Department of the Interior, Fish and Wildlife, NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And that's how demagogues and totalitarians do their work. I admire you.
Exactly, that's what was on my mind.
Right.
That whether they were threatened or whether they saw this as some kind of way to obtain favor and to their advantage, either way it was placing, protecting power
and
above
threatening
society.
scientists, hiding information, and heading us back to what Carl Sagan and others have called the demon-haunted world. I think you also make a good point about the ethical drive that compelled you, because various codes of medical ethics actually state that it's not just a physician's duty to care for his or her individual patient, but to care for society as a whole. And when we recognize dangers confronting society, be it a mentally unfit or unstable president, or pollutants leaking into the water supply, or an outbreak of disease that's traced back to problems with a restaurant, say not having their cooks wash their hands. From the less serious to the extremely serious, being nuclear war, we do have an obligation to speak out. Now, the other case I was talking about, just for our viewers, was with the American Psychological Association then. And they have subsequently changed their policy, but they previously had a policy that was in support of two psychologists who were working with the CIA, making up to $1,800 a day, and then starting a company that made $81 million through torture itself. And so I think it's one of the ways to wrap our heads around this is that their medical organizations are not always good, and they don't always represent all doctors. And there are bad doctors out there too.
Well, we have to be a check on our own professional associations.
Exactly.
If we concede our our independent thinking and not act as our own moral agents, then associations are bound to abuse their power, as we saw. I mean, the American Psychological Association did very much what their psychiatric counterpart did. Under governmental pressure, they changed ethical guidelines so that these military psychologists could carry out torture.
Mm-hmm. It's dark times for science, and it's dangerous times for the world. Unfortunately, this has been such a fascinating discussion that we only have about 45 seconds here for you to say, and time flies, for you to say what our viewers can do, other than, of course, buy your book, which my aunt and my cousin, interestingly, I found out on the way over here, are fighting over. They have one copy. So, other than, of course, buying the book, and we've put some websites on the screen at the bottom that they can go to get more information. What do you suggest that the average Joe and Jane does?
Well, all that we do, the book and the report on the Mueller report, which shows with hard data that the president does not have basic mental capacity to carry out his functions of office. We are offering this information to help empower the public, because eventually it is really in the hands of the public to determine its destiny, and I believe the public has more power than it realizes, that even politicians cannot act unless they have endorsement from the public. And so I think there's a lot that can be done, and we're doing our part. We're hoping to basically allow the public to do it.
Well, I want to thank you for doing that, and I want to thank you for your courage. I want to thank you for helping to educate us, and I guess I'll answer my own question, is that since we are still a democracy, the way to fix this, at the very least, is vote. We know in the United States that the poor vote less than the rich, that those with less education vote less often than those with more. Blacks vote less than whites. Latinos vote less than Caucasians. And it's important that all of us, it's imperative that all of us go out to the polls, not just to vote for the office of president, but to vote for someone who will hopefully restore us to the ideals that, at least on paper, are supposed to represent this country and that are at serious risk now. Dr. Lee, thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and we hope maybe we'll hear some more from you in the future, but hopefully when things have gotten a little bit better. This has been Prescription for Justice. Thank you. My name is Martin Donahoe. Please join us on our next episode.